December 4th, 1956. Budapest. The temperature has dropped to -12 degrees Celsius. Inside the Hungarian State Opera House, the velvet curtains hang heavy with frost that has crept through shattered windows. Eszter Kovács stands alone in her dressing room, still wearing the costume from tonight's performance of Madama Butterfly. Her hands tremble as she holds a photograph she found hidden in David Hartley's coat pocket. Not a photograph of her, not a love letter, but a perfect, detailed image of documents she never knew existed in this very room. Documents that list names, addresses, meeting places. The photograph is dated 3 days ago. 3 days before Soviet tanks surrounded the safe house on Andrassy Avenue. 3 days before 12, resistance fighters were dragged into the street and executed. Her reflection stares back from the mirror, stage makeup still perfect, lips still red. But something inside her has shattered more completely than any window, because she knows now what she has been. Not a lover, not a patriot, but a bridge. A bridge that led the wolves directly to the lambs. 18 months earlier, the story was entirely different. May 1955. Spring had come to Budapest with unusual warmth, and the city felt alive in ways it hadn't since before the war. Eszter Kovács was 28 years old and already considered one of Hungary's most promising sopranos. Her voice had a quality that critics struggled to describe. Haunting, some said. Others called it achingly pure. What they all agreed on was that when Eszter sang, something in the room changed. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. She had been performing at the State Opera House for 6 years, surviving the transition from Nazi occupation to Soviet control by doing what artists have always done. She sang. She didn't ask questions. She kept her head down, and she told herself that music existed above politics, in some pure realm where beauty mattered more than borders. David Hartley arrived in Budapest that spring as a cultural attaché to the American legation. At 32, he was young for a diplomat, charming in that effortless way Americans often were, with sandy hair that never quite stayed in place and a smile that made people want to trust him. His official role was to foster cultural exchanges, to attend performances and exhibitions, to write reports about Hungarian artistic life for audiences back in Washington. His real role, of course, was something else entirely. But Eszter didn't know that when they first met at a reception following her performance as Violetta in La Traviata. She only knew that when he approached her with a glass of champagne and told her in careful, accented Hungarian that her voice had moved him to tears. Something in his eyes seemed genuine. Something that cut through the usual diplomatic flattery. Their first real conversation lasted 3 hours. They stood on a balcony overlooking the Danube while the reception continued inside, talking about music and literature, and all the careful, coded things people talked about in a city where walls had ears. David told her about growing up in Boston, about his mother who had sung in church choirs, about how he'd always loved opera but never really understood it until tonight. Eszter told him about learning to sing as a child in Debrecen, about her father who had been a music teacher before the war, about the strange isolation of being an artist in a world that seemed to value everything except art. They didn't talk about politics. They didn't talk about the Soviet soldiers on every corner or the portraits of Stalin that hung in every public building. They talked about beauty and loss, and the things that made life worth living even when the world seemed determined to crush beauty wherever it grew. When the reception ended, David asked if he could see her again. Eszter said yes without hesitation, and only later, lying awake in her small apartment, did she wonder if that hesitation should have been there. Their romance developed slowly, carefully, with all the caution required in a surveillance state. They met in public places at first, cafes along Vasai Street, walks on Margaret Island. Always in daylight, always where their meetings could be explained as innocent cultural exchange. But within weeks, the pretense became harder to maintain. The attraction between them was too strong, too immediate. By July, David was attending every one of her performances, always sitting in the same seat in the third row, always bringing flowers backstage afterward. By August, he was staying late in her dressing room after the other performers had left, and their conversations had moved from art to dreams to confessions. And by September, when the first autumn chill touched Budapest, they were lovers in every sense of the word. Eszter had never felt anything like what she felt with David. It wasn't just desire, though that was part of it. It was a sense of being truly seen for the first time in her life. With David, she didn't have to be careful. She didn't have to weigh every word. She could be angry about the occupation, frightened about the future, hopeful about impossible things. He listened to all of it with an intensity that made her feel like the most important person in the world. What Eszter didn't know was that her dressing room had been chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with her voice. The Hungarian State Opera House was a jewel of Habsburg architecture, built in the 1880s with a labyrinth of backstage corridors, hidden staircases, and forgotten storage rooms. It was also one of the few buildings in Budapest where resistance fighters could move relatively freely. Soviet officials attended performances regularly, which meant security focused outward, on protecting the audience, not on monitoring the warren of rooms behind the stage. And Eszter's dressing room, specifically, had a feature that made it invaluable. A loose panel in the wall behind her costume rack, installed decades ago by stagehands who used it to move props between floors. A panel that opened into a narrow shaft that connected to the building's old heating system. A perfect dead drop for documents that needed to move through the city unseen. The resistance had been using her room for months before David arrived. They chose her specifically because she was apolitical, uninvolved, focused entirely on her art. She would never notice the panel. She would never ask questions. She was perfect precisely because she was oblivious. David Hartley noticed the panel during his third visit to her dressing room. He had been trained to notice such things, trained to spot the small inconsistencies that revealed hidden spaces, trained to recognize the signs of clandestine activity. He said nothing to Eszter, just filed the information away and continued their evening as planned. But the next day, he sent a coded message to his handler at the Central Intelligence Agency station in Vienna. The message was brief. Possible resistance dead drop identified. Monitoring recommended. Within a week, David had a miniature camera hidden in his cigarette case and instructions to photograph anything he found in that space. The justification was simple. The Hungarian resistance was brave but disorganized, and some of its members had ties to Soviet intelligence. By monitoring their communications, the agency could identify which resistance cells were genuine and which were controlled opposition. They could protect real freedom fighters from infiltration. They could help the cause of Hungarian independence. David believed this completely. He believed it when he first started photographing documents. He believed it when he passed those photographs to his handlers. He believed it even as he fell deeper in love with Eszter, because he had convinced himself that what he was doing would ultimately help her country, help the cause of freedom itself. The Hungarian Revolution began on October 23, 1956. It started with students marching to the statue of Sandor Petofi, the poet who had died in the 1848 revolution against Habsburg rule. They carried banners demanding free elections, free press, the withdrawal of Soviet troops. By afternoon, the crowd had swelled to hundreds of thousands. By evening, they had toppled the massive statue of Stalin in City Park, leaving only his boots on the pedestal. And by midnight, Soviet tanks were firing into crowds of unarmed civilians. Eszter was at the Opera House when the revolution started. She had a performance scheduled for that evening, Puccini's Tosca, but it was canceled when the theater management fled. She stood backstage with the other performers, listening to the sounds of gunfire echoing across the city, and felt something break open inside her. All the careful neutrality she had maintained for years suddenly seemed obscene. Her country was rising up, and she had been singing pretty songs for the occupiers. She went home that night through streets filled with smoke and broken glass, and when she arrived at her apartment, she found 3 young men waiting in her hallway. Resistance fighters, barely out of their teens, with rifles slung over their shoulders and desperation in their eyes. They knew about the panel in her dressing room. They needed to know if she had been aware, if she had been compromised, if the location was still secure. Eszter told them the truth. She had known nothing. But now that she did know, now that the revolution had started, she wanted to help. The young men looked at each other, weighing the risk. Finally, the oldest one, who couldn't have been more than 22, nodded. They needed her. They needed the Opera House. They needed every safe space they could find because the Soviets were hunting them street by street. Eszter became part of the resistance that night. Not a fighter, but something equally important, a guardian of secrets, a keeper of the dead drop. For the next 6 weeks, as Budapest tore itself apart, she moved documents through her dressing room. Lists of weapons caches, plans for demonstrations, names of sympathetic soldiers in the Hungarian army. She did it carefully, never looking at the documents themselves, never asking questions. And she never told David. She told herself it was for his safety. If he didn't know, he couldn't be implicated. But somewhere deeper, in a place she didn't want to examine, she knew the real reason. She didn't tell him because she wasn't sure whose side he would be on. David continued photographing documents throughout the revolution. His handlers in Vienna were desperate for intelligence. The uprising had caught everyone by surprise, and the agency needed to understand the resistance structure, needed to know who the real leaders were, needed to assess whether this revolution could actually succeed. David worked with frantic energy, visiting Eszter's dressing room whenever possible, always with his cigarette case camera, always careful to leave no trace. He told himself he was helping. The information he gathered would allow the Americans to provide better support to the resistance. It would save lives. It would make a difference. He never questioned why his handlers never asked him to make contact with the resistance directly. Never wondered why the intelligence only flowed one direction. He was in love, and love made him stupid in ways his training had never anticipated. He looked at Eszter and saw only beauty and courage and everything worth protecting in this world. He never saw the way she had started looking at him, the new wariness in her eyes, the questions she didn't ask. The Soviet counterattack came on November 4th. Thousands of tanks rolled into Budapest at dawn, accompanied by special forces units trained in urban warfare. The resistance fought back with Molotov cocktails and captured weapons and desperate courage, but it was hopeless from the start. The Soviets had learned from the first week of the uprising. This time, they showed no mercy. They surrounded resistance strongholds and shelled them into rubble. They executed fighters in the streets. They dragged suspected sympathizers from their homes, and they worked from lists, very specific lists. Lists of names and addresses that someone had provided. Lists that led them directly to safe houses and weapons caches and the homes of resistance leaders. The safe house on Andrassy Avenue was hit on November 7th. 12 fighters were inside, including 2 of the young men who had first approached Eszter. The Soviets surrounded the building at 3 in the morning and gave no warning. Just gunfire and grenades and systematic execution. By dawn, all 12 were dead, their bodies left in the street as a warning. Eszter heard about the raid the next morning. She was at the Opera House, which had become a makeshift hospital for wounded fighters. Someone brought the news and she felt her legs give out. Those boys, those brave, foolish boys who had trusted her with their secrets, dead, all dead. And something in the way the raid had been conducted, the precision of it, the timing, made her stomach turn. She went to her dressing room and checked the panel. Empty, as it should be. But when she looked more carefully, she saw something she had never noticed before. Tiny scratches on the wall beside the panel. Fresh scratches, as if someone had been working in dim light, trying to photograph something in a hurry. Her hands were shaking as she searched the room. She found David's cigarette case under her makeup table, where it must have fallen during his last visit. She opened it, saw the camera mechanism, saw the tiny roll of film still inside, and understood everything. She confronted him that night. He came to her apartment as he always did, with flowers and that smile that had once made her heart race. But this time she didn't let him kiss her. She just held up the cigarette case and watched his face change, watched the smile die, watched him become someone else entirely, someone careful and calculating and very, very dangerous. He tried to explain, tried to tell her about the larger picture, about how the intelligence was meant to help, about how he had never intended for anyone to get hurt. But Eszter wasn't listening to his words. She was listening to the silence beneath them, the silence where an apology should have been, the silence where shame should have lived, and she realized that David Hartley didn't think he had done anything wrong. He had betrayed her, betrayed the resistance, betrayed everything she had risked her life to protect, and he still thought he was the hero of this story. The next 2 weeks were a special kind of hell. The revolution was collapsing. Thousands of Hungarians were fleeing across the Austrian border. The Soviets were consolidating control, arresting anyone suspected of involvement in the uprising. And Eszter was trapped between 2 impossible choices. She could expose David, tell the resistance what he had done, let them deal with him in their own way. But that would mean admitting her own blindness, her own complicity. It would mean accepting that her love had been used as a weapon against her own people. Or she could stay silent, protect him, help him escape to Vienna before the Soviets connected him to the intelligence leaks. But that would mean letting him walk away unpunished. It would mean betraying the memory of those 12 dead fighters. It would mean living with the knowledge that she had chosen love over justice. She spent those weeks in a fog of grief and rage and guilt. David kept trying to see her, kept sending messages through intermediaries, kept insisting they needed to talk. But Eszter couldn't bear to look at him. Couldn't bear to see the face she had loved and know what it had cost. On November 22nd, the remaining resistance leadership made contact with Eszter. They knew about David. They had pieced together the connection between his access to her dressing room and the Soviet raids. They wanted him dead. They had a plan, a way to lure him to a location where he could be dealt with quietly. All they needed was for Eszter to send him a message, to tell him she forgave him, to ask him to meet her one last time, They were very clear about what would happen. David Hartley would not leave that meeting alive. And they were equally clear about what would happen to Eszter if she refused. She had been compromised. She knew too much. If she wouldn't help them eliminate the threat, she would become a threat herself. Eszter asked for 24 hours to decide. They gave her 12. She spent those 12 hours walking through the ruins of Budapest. The city she loved had been transformed into something unrecognizable, buildings reduced to rubble, streets cratered by tank fire, bodies still lying where they had fallen because there was no one left to bury them. She walked past the opera house, its beautiful facade pocked with bullet holes. She walked past the safe house on Andrassy Avenue, where blood still stained the cobblestones. She walked until her feet bled and her mind went numb. And somewhere in those frozen streets, she made her choice. Not the choice the resistance wanted, not the choice David deserved, but the only choice she could live with. She went to the American legation at dawn on November 23rd. The building was surrounded by Soviet soldiers, but they let her through when she said she had information about an American diplomat. She was taken to a small office where a man who introduced himself as David's superior waited with cold eyes and a tape recorder. Eszter told him everything, about the dressing room, about the panel, about the photographs, about the 12 dead fighters. She gave him dates and details and enough evidence that there could be no doubt. And then she told him what she wanted in return. David Hartley was recalled to Washington within 48 hours. The official story was a routine rotation. The real story was buried in classified files that wouldn't be declassified for 50 years. He was never prosecuted, never formally disciplined, but his career in intelligence was over. He spent the rest of his life working in minor diplomatic posts in countries that didn't matter, pushing paper and attending receptions and slowly drinking himself to death. He died in 1983, alone in a studio apartment in Arlington, Virginia. His obituary mentioned his service in Hungary but gave no details. Eszter never saw him again after that morning at the legation. As part of her agreement, she was given passage to Vienna, then to London, then finally to New York. She never performed in Hungary again, never returned to the country she had tried to save. She built a new career in America, singing at the Metropolitan Opera and teaching at Juilliard. She married eventually, a kind man who knew nothing about her past, and had 2 daughters who grew up thinking their mother had simply fled the revolution like thousands of others. She never told them the truth, never told anyone the truth, because how do you explain that you saved the life of the man who betrayed everything you believed in? How do you explain that you couldn't bring yourself to kill him, even knowing what he had done? How do you explain that love, even poisoned love, even love built on lies, still has power over us? The documents David photographed were used by Soviet intelligence to systematically dismantle the Hungarian resistance. Over 300 fighters were arrested in the months following the revolution. 62 were executed. The rest disappeared into the Gulag system. The dead drop in Eszter's dressing room was discovered and sealed. The opera house itself was closed for 6 months while the Soviets purged its staff of suspected sympathizers. When it reopened, a new soprano sang the roles Eszter had made famous. But the critics said her voice lacked something. Lacked the haunting quality that had made Eszter Kovács special. They couldn't quite articulate what was missing. But anyone who had heard Eszter sing before the revolution and after could tell you. It was the sound of innocence. The belief that beauty could exist separate from the world's ugliness. That love could transcend politics. That art mattered more than survival. Esther lost that belief in a frozen dressing room in December 1956, holding a photograph that proved how completely she had been used. And once lost, that kind of innocence can never be recovered. In her final years living in a brownstone in Manhattan, Esther would sometimes take out a photograph of her own, not one of David. She had burned all of those. But a photograph of the Hungarian State Opera House, taken in 1954 before any of it happened. In the photograph, the building glows in afternoon light, beautiful and eternal, untouched by war or revolution or betrayal. She would look at that photograph and remember what it felt like to stand on that stage and sing, believing that her voice could change something, believing that beauty mattered, believing in love. She died in 2003 at the age of 76. Her daughters found the photograph in her desk drawer, along with a letter she had written but never sent. The letter was addressed to David, though he had been dead for 20 years. It said only this: "I saved you because I loved you. I have hated you for it every day since. I hope that wherever you are, you finally understand what you destroyed." The letter was never delivered, but perhaps that was the point. Some betrayals are too large for forgiveness. Some choices haunt us precisely because they were the right ones. And some loves survive only as scars, reminders of the people we were before we learned that the world breaks everyone. And afterward, some are strong in the broken places, and some never heal at all.